Okay, urinary system. Here we are with the urinary system. The kidneys are right here. So that's doing the main work. You see the adrenal glands on top. It's not part of the urinary system, but you can see the kidneys, the ureter, then the bladder. Sorry, just pointing to the uterus, the bladder, and the urethra. So you can see the renal vein and renal arteries. You'll notice that the right side, the right kidney is a little bit lower than the left kidney. And these are the functions of the kidneys. So we tend to think that the kidney's main job is to get rid of waste. And it is one of the jobs, but a lot of people would say that the number one function of the kidneys is to regulate ions in your body. Of course, I mean, they're all equally important, aren't they? So regulating ions. So I gave you some examples here: calcium, chlorine, potassium, sodium, bicarbonate, glucose, and some other things, some other proteins. So anyway, it regulates blood ions. It regulates the pH of blood, and that is through, as you see here, through excreting protons or not excreting protons. That's the H+, or bicarbonate. The kidney has the ability to make bicarbonate. So your body has two methods of controlling pH. One is the kidneys and one is the lungs. So as you breathe out faster, you will raise your pH. And then the other thing you can do is excrete protons, or you can make bicarbonate. So blood volume regulation, by regulating the amount of water that you use for urine or not use for urine, right? So remember, like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. So by doing that, you can regulate blood volume. And you could regulate blood pressure. And then excretion of waste. So here's a little larger view of the kidney, and we have a frontal section, and you can see some of the features of it. So there's a capsule, a cortex, and a medulla. It's that setup again, right? And so you see the cortex is like the lighter color, and then the darker color is the medulla of the kidney. And you can see the medulla, that it looks like what are pyramids, and those are pyramids. We call them renal pyramids, and in between the pyramids are renal columns, right? So there's one, and there's another one. This yellow stuff is just adipose tissue, and you can see the artery going in and the vein coming out. And so here we have the calyx. So you have a major calyx and a minor calyx. So these small ones that I'm kind of putting the pointers on are minor calyces. And then the major calyces or major calyx, they're like in more. You know, where's the dividing line between them? I don't know, who knows. All right. And this area in here is the renal pelvis, and that's where all the major calyces converge into the renal pelvis, and then the renal pelvis is going to become the ureter. The main functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, and there's only one nephron in this photo, but in reality, there's millions. So the nephron is the part of the kidney where filtrate fluid from your blood is going to get filtered into the nephron, and then there's like an exchange. So I'm going to show you on the next slide, but you see like that ball where I'm pointing with the pointer? That's called the glomerulus. And then everything else, after that little ball, it's just a bunch of squiggly tubes. Like it's squiggly here, and then it drops down, and then it's squiggly a little bit again, right? And that's called the different ducts. All right, here we go. So we have a larger view here. So here's the glomerulus, that ball, and you can see where the blood is joining with it. And so this is where fluid is first going to pass into the nephron. So fluid from blood passes into the nephron. And right here, it's all convoluted. And so we call this one the convoluted distal tubule because it's a tube. It's all convoluted looking. And distal meaning closer to the glomerulus. Then you notice here it drops down, and this is the loop of Henle. So it loops down, and then it gets not so convoluted looking here, but it is. So we call this the distal convoluted tubule. And then that's going to go into a collecting duct. So lots of different nephrons are going to join into one collecting duct. And then if you follow it down, you see that it eventually, becomes the ureter. And if you look right here, it kind of shows you how fluid flows. So the glomerulus has a capsule around it, so it's got to bust through that capsule. And so that's why you see the first one's called the glomerular or Bowman's capsule. And then the proximal convoluted tubule, then it goes down and there's different, you see here, there's like different loops, right? So there's like the descending loop. And if you notice right here, it gets a lot thinner. So you can call it like the thick descending and the thin descending. And here's the ascending loop. And again, thin and thick. And if you really get into renal physiology, which we're not going to do, different parts of this tube work on different things. Like different parts of these tubes are where water goes. Water will enter from the blood a lot more in certain areas. For example, like the distal convoluted tubule, for example, is one place. Or glucose will pass through more in one place versus another, or sodium will pass. So we're not going to go into it, but that's why they differentiate. And then you have the distal convoluted tubule, and then from there it goes into the collecting ducts and things like that. You have let me go back here. This is so most of the nephrons in your kidneys are called cortical nephrons, and so this loop will probably loop down to about here, where I'm kind of looping it here with my with the mouse. And so those are cortical. About 80% of the nephrons are like that. And then these that you see here, like this loop is going pretty far down, and so that's called I can never say the word juxtamedullary. Whatever, it's close enough. That's for making really concentrated or making really dilute urine, and that's about 20% of the nephrons. So here we have a closer view of the Bowman's capsule of the glomerulus with the capsule around it, and so you can see all the so imagine the renal artery. That renal artery is going to start getting smaller, and I don't think I'm not doing it because probably for time. But those arteries from the renal artery, it keeps getting smaller and smaller until finally at the end. So you'll see in the book, you have like interlobar and arcuate and interlobular, and different types of arteries, and they're getting small and smaller and becoming like capillaries. And then finally, you have an arterial afferent going in and efferent going out. And so here's the blood, and the fluid, which we're going to call filtered fluid, ends up going in to the kidney at this point. Now, as it flows through, as it's flowing through, there is an initial push of fluid into the kidney. So going from the red here to the yellow, there's an initial flow of fluid. And then as it's going through all these tubules, there's some fluid that flows back. There's like an exchange. You know, it's like the kidneys are saying, okay, I gave you this. I didn't mean to give you this much fluid. Give me some of this back. I dumped a bunch of glucose in that initial push of fluid. Give me some of it back. Right? So there's some back and forth going on. And so that's what this is called. Actually, I might have a slide on that. Yeah, okay. So this might be a little bit better. So, so you have filtration from the blood, that initial fluid that's going from the blood into the glomerulus, into the kidney. Then you have some fluid going back into the blood again. So we call that reabsorption. And then remember, it's similar to like filtration and reabsorption, right? So when you were thinking about the chapter on blood capillaries, filtration was fluid leaving the capillary, and reabsorption was fluid going back into the blood again. Same thing here. So we call this filtration. It's fluid leaving the, we'll call it a capillary at this point. It's an arterial, but the fluid leaving the blood, so that's filtration. Then you have reabsorption, fluid going back into the blood again. And then you have a final third exchange. It's called secretion. So you have fluid going right back into the nephron again. And so I kind of have it written down here, the three parts of this: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So fluid flowing into the kidney. Some things flow back into the blood, and some things flow back into the kidney again. And so you can kind of see here what tends to get filtered. So what's driving this pressure? And this is kind of important because people with hypertension, high blood pressure, the first damage often will be to the kidneys, and within the kidneys, it's the nephron. So you have to think about the pressure. So remember, the pressure coming out of the heart, the pressure in your arm when you take a blood pressure is like 100 over 80, and we're just kind of calling that 100. So the pressure in the arteries, up in your arms is something like 100, right? But by the time that pressure gets down to your kidneys, it's about 55 millimeters of mercury. So that's the pressure going right. That's the pressure here at like number 1. The pressure going in is 55. Now, this isn't, they're not showing you here, but there's a capsule around it, and you have to bust through that capsule. So that reduces some of the pressure, right? So you take off like 15 for that. And then, just like we talked about with blood vessels, there's an osmotic pressure. So there's proteins in the plasma, like albumin, that's one of your plasma proteins. And the fact that that's in the blood, that's also an opposing pressure. So if you have 55 millimeters of mercury generated by your heart, just the fact that your blood vessels are pressurized, right? And then you subtract the 15 from that and 30 more from that. So you would get down to about 10, right? So 10, ideally, you want this around here to be like 10 millimeters of mercury. Right? If you got 100 coming out of your heart, by the time it gets down to the kidney, you want it to eventually get down to like 55. By the time it actually gets into the nephron, it should only be like 10, right? And so these bottom two pressures are relatively fixed, right? You're always going to have that opposing pressure from the capsule. And it's always going to be like around 15 millimeters of mercury. And then you're, generally speaking, you're going to have those relatively the same amount of plasma proteins. But what happens when your blood pressure goes up, right? So now your blood pressure is not 120/80, it's 150/110. That's really high. It's super high. And so now you're going to add, instead of 55, we're going to make that like 75 or 70, right? Let's just even make it 70, right? So that the pressure at the end, when you subtract everything, is no longer 10. It'll be like 25. It was like twice as much or 3 times as much as the as this nephron can handle. Oh, and look, this slide is doing the same thing, right? So you're looking at about 10. You don't want that to go higher. These are very delicate, your nephrons, right? And so you can start blowing out your nephrons with high blood pressure, and then it's not going to work anymore. So that's the danger of high blood pressure. And if you think about blood pressure meds, they're lowering blood pressure by encouraging you to get rid of fluid. They're going to encourage the kidneys to dump water. You're urinating more. You are running dehydrated, and in that case, it's high blood pressure or be dehydrated. Right? So you always go with being dehydrated, because once you blow out the nephrons, they're not going to fix themselves. They're not going to come back. You're going to go on dialysis. So it's one problem with high blood pressure. And so that's something that if you're going to work in a hospital setting, you're going to see this all the time. Right? And you're going to start associating things with patients, like you're going to see hypertension, and then you might see like diabetes. It'll say like HTN, DM. Might even say like CVA for stroke. Those things are always together. And then renal failure. Like you see them together. You just start assuming that these things are going to go together. So it's a very common thing for high blood pressure to start affecting the kidneys. And there's, of course, lots of things that can affect it, which we really can't go into. But let me talk about electrolytes. And I fit all this into one slide, but it's really more than this. And this particular slide is not on the PowerPoint, because it's considered a different chapter. But electrolytes are important, and I would at least like you to know these first 3, right? And these aren't the only ones. So first of all, before we get into it, some terms. Remember the term cation and anion. Anion are things that are negatively charged. Cations are things that are positively charged. Your fluid in your body, we can divide into fluid in our cells and fluid outside of our cells. So extracellular fluid, intracellular fluid. Now, that being said, let's look at the first one, sodium, which remember is like written as Na+. So sodium is the main cation in your extracellular fluid. It does a lot of things, which I didn't mention all of them here, but if you remember back to generating a heartbeat, like that action potential where you had sodium quickly going into the myocardiocyte, the heart cells. Water follows sodium. So if you remember, like aldosterone, you manipulate sodium levels and thereby manipulating water levels, right? So I put here blood volume and I put action potentials, right? So it influences fluid, it influences action potentials, it helps your nerves to fire, your muscles. And then I put a lab level, which I'd like you to know, right? And you might have a different level in your head. Remember, labs are ranges. And one number doesn't mean anything by itself. So if you come back with labs and you look at like now, places, now most labs, they put everything in a column, and then if it's high, they'll like flag it in like red or blue, and they'll put it over to the side. It'll say 149H, and then you're like, oh shit, it's called hypernatremia. I have hypernatremia. Okay, so what? I mean, that's just one. First of all, it's one number over. Second of all, that's just one electrolyte. That's just one thing on the lab. You have to look at some other things. So don't ever get freaked out with one lab and with just a small number at one time. But anyway, that's kind of the range around there. And different labs have different ranges, but they're going to be around that. Chloride is the main extracellular anion, so it's negatively charged, right? And it does a lot of things too. And it's used in making hydrochloric acid in your stomach. So I just put one example, and you want somewhere around 100 milliequivalents per liter. That's what that stands for. Potassium works a little different. So, by the way, sodium, not enough or too much, we use the word natremia. And so I always think of like, the sign for sodium is Na plus, and so the plus is like a T, so NAT, natremia, right? Potassium is really the one that you're going to see like in a medical setting, right? So it's very common, and it's not going to be hyperkalemia, it's going to be hypokalemia. And you remember kalemia because the sign for potassium is a K plus, right? K for kalemia, Na for natremia, right? So hypokalemia is common. People that are on laxatives, people that are on steroids, people that are on like Lasix, water pills, I don't know, diuretics, right? So diuretics, laxatives, steroids, people that are dehydrated. So someone that's really sick, someone with food poisoning, something like that, they're going to have, it's very common to have low potassium, right? And so this one works a little bit different. This is millimoles per liter. And, the fact that it's millimoles versus milliequivalents, who cares, right? It's the number. So 3.5 to 5. So it's a lot different. So that's potassium. Potassium is really tricky. Too much will kill you. Too little will kill you. Too much will stop your heart. Too little will make your heart flutter. They're really careful about giving. If you look at an IV bag, it's sodium chloride. It's sodium and chloride. So that's sodium chloride, but potassium, that's going to be made by the pharmacy, right? And so, but always watch. Always make sure that whatever's being given, like if you're going to be a nurse, everything's on you, right? It's your ass for everything. Yes, the doctors are technically responsible for everything, and they act like they are everything, right? But you're going to get fired before them. The pharmacist is supposed to make sure that the potassium is correct because they're making it in the pharmacy, and the doctor's supposed to make sure. But you know what? Sometimes it's really all about you. So watch for these things because that sometimes kills people. That is the end of this. I really, really didn't give you enough. I really didn't give you enough of renal physiology. You're going to be bombarded with it if you're going to like nursing school or something like that. And so, but the it's a rather short semester, so we're out of time. If you have any questions on any of that, you have the PowerPoint, feel free to reach out to me.